been challenged so deeply by my children showing me more about who Jesus is.
Hello and welcome to Talking Theology, the podcast of Cranmer Hall in Durham. My name is Nick Moore, and this episode we're thinking about how we grow faith at home. It's a delight to be joined by Sarah Strand. Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Dean of Anglican Formation at Cranmer Hall, and that involves oversight of our ordained ministry training within the Church of England at Cranmer Hall. That includes our training that surrounds our academic programmes, so thinking about our worship, our discipleship groups, our tutorials, and the formational teaching that we do that sits outside our academic programme as well. I teach, and I'm also part of the senior leadership team at Cranmer as well.
Great. And for the last couple of years, you've been leading the Growing Faith Learning Hub at Cranmer. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've partnered with the Growing Faith Foundation in the Church of England for the last 2 years to be a dedicated research and training hub, thinking about particularly issues around ministry with children and young people. We've been absolutely delighted to do that. We've met lots of different people over the last couple of years, and the big thing that we've done is a research project exploring children's perspectives on faith and the Bible and prayer in primary schools and secondary schools in County Durham. So we've spoken to over 400 children and young people, and we're in the process at the moment of publishing a report with all of our findings, some really amazing things. And so it was great to have that research at the heart of the Growing Faith hub that we have. The funding has now come to an end, and we're exploring what might come next. We're really hoping for to carry on our kind of research and the hopes that and the aims and the vision that was at the heart of that hub for the last couple of years.
In addition to that research, you've also written a book. It's called Growing Together in Faith, co-authored with Rev Emma Parker, who is a vicar in the Diocese of Durham. So we're going to talk about that. Could you tell us, first of all, how did your interest in growing faith at home develop from the personal level, which is simply, how do I help my kids to grow in their faith, through to the wanting to engage more academically and rigorously in theological work on the topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it came to the time, I've got two children who are 6 and 9. When it came to thinking about when I was pregnant with my first child, thinking about how we might grow faith at home with my husband, I was brought up going to church, but hadn't actually had lots of input in the home about what it meant to grow in faith and what it meant to be a Christian. My husband had, and so we had lots of different conversations about what it might look like for us as a family. And when I was looking for reading and resources and things to kind of enable me to go deeper than just the practical, there are loads of fantastic resources available for thinking about parenting for faith at home. But I wanted something that was going to go a little bit deeper for me and enable me to think about the theological aspects of that as well as the practical aspects of that. And one of my biggest passions is reading as well, and particularly reading with children and thinking about the way that literature helps and informs so many different aspects, and storytelling as well informs so many different aspects of our lives. And when those two things came together, so I really wanted to think about children and faith and Bible reading and storytelling and theological resources, there really wasn't very much for me to be able to find. And so I decided to step into that space myself. And what started out as a kind of that practical passion, kind of as you said, thinking about growing faith at home, has gradually shifted into an academic interest for me. But it's been really important to me to maintain that balance between theology and practice, and not kind of separate those two things out. So I see that as a really kind of integrated thing in the work and the research that I do.
Many of the best ideas and resources, I think, do come from that spark of I'm looking for something and it just isn't there. So that's wonderful to hear. Now, in thinking about faith at home, you look to the Bible and to the Old Testament, and particular to the concept of the Beit Av, the household of God. Could you tell us a bit about how that concept challenges the ways that we in 21st century Britain might think about faith formation and families.
Yeah. So just to dig into a little bit about that concept first, before I answer the kind of second part of that question, this is the idea that there was a kind of residential family community in the Old Testament. So if we're thinking about Deuteronomy and we're thinking about the ways in which kind of Near Eastern ancient societies were formed, it wasn't a nuclear family. So there were loads of different elements of what it meant to be the household of God. So it was family with kinship ties, it was slaves, it was extended family members, it was all different generations, and it was a real focus, the kind of family community, the household of God was a real focus of liturgical practice and religious practice and social practice. So it was kind of the much bigger unit around all those things kind of integrated together intergenerationally. And I think it's fair to say that 21st century parenting is a massive contrast to that and family life. We still have, this is a legacy, I think, from the early 20th century, we have an enormous emphasis on the nuclear family, and that idea of two parents and two children and a kind of isolated family unit in that perspective. And I think if we place those two things in conversation with each other, that kind of biblical Old Testament understanding of what a family community meant, the household of God, under God, and the way that we currently culturally see ideas of family, they're quite far apart. And I think it's really important to recognise that we don't actually live in the ancient Near East. So what I don't want to argue for is some kind of trying to retrieve some biblical model that is not possible and doesn't really exist. So I want to be really clear that I'm just not trying to replicate something that we see in the Bible, which I think sometimes we can do when we talk about family life particularly. But I think there are some challenges that we can take from that Old Testament perspective that might really speak into our current context at the moment in the 21st century. And I think that's firstly about kind of complexifying our ideas of family and community. So drawing that bigger picture, this is something that I talk about in the book as well, that sense of village and family and community being extended beyond that idea of the nuclear family. And I think that does involve church. So the church community, the church family, is offering something that's much more substantial than a kind of isolated perspective of family. I think there's something really significant about recognising the role of all generations in encountering faith together. So what would have happened, particularly when we think about this idea of the Beit Av, is people would, the whole family community would have engaged in listening to the stories of Scripture together. And children would have been really as actively involved in that as other family members and adults. And so there's something really significant about everybody being involved in the social and the religious, the theological practices of family. And I think finally, just thinking really about how we share Bible stories within our families and communities and contexts. There's been a little bit of a move in the 20th century. I think the Sunday school movement has given us loads of really great things, but one of the things it has given us as well, and our kind of educational approach to the reading the Bible, is it has professionalized a little bit and separated Bible reading from the family home. So we know that children are going to encounter that in church, and children are going to encounter that at school in different ways and in quite particular ways. And I think what we see in that the Beit Av is the bringing together of storytelling in a family context. So bringing that back into the home, and thinking about how the sharing of stories of faith, and particularly stories of the Bible, can become more integrated into our family lives.
When you spoke of intergenerational worship, we had our family all age service at church this Sunday just gone, and we often do a little testimony or interview slot, and it was with one of the oldest ladies in the church, so I think in her 90s now, and I just thought this was brilliant in terms of that intergenerational learning from one another. When you look around today, what do you think is one of the hardest aspects of being a parent who's seeking to grow faith, nurture faith at home, and how do you think we can best address that challenge?
Absolutely. I think I could say lots of things here, but one of the things that I've been thinking about particularly recently has been the perception that parents aren't the best person to do this job. So I think this ties into some of the things I was saying earlier about church and school being seen as places that faith can be explored. That's really important. Yeah, absolutely essential. But there can be a sense that parents aren't confident and aren't equipped, and therefore don't have the time and are under all these different pressures, and therefore they aren't the best people necessarily to do this. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I want to challenge, that parents know their children better than anybody else. That yes, of course, they spend lots of time in education settings. They don't spend that much time in church, even if they go to church every Sunday. It's a couple of hours a week. And there's lots of other time, lots of other ways for us to think about exploring faith at home that don't have to be incredibly demanding. There are lots and lots of pressures and challenges for everybody, no matter what their family circumstances, in the 21st century, in the day that we live in. But parents absolutely are the best people to be able to do this job of discipleship in the home together. So I think that's one of those challenges that can be addressed, really. And I think we might dig into that a little bit later as well.
Well, building on that point, you discuss research on faith formation in households during COVID, and through that you draw attention to a gap in understanding between church leaders and parents. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so Sarah Holmes and a host of other really fantastic organisations collaborated together to do this research, and it showed that parents and church leaders had really different perceptions of faith at home during COVID. So in general, absolutely go and read the research, because I think it's really great and insightful. But in general, parents thought that the faith in their family had really flourished during COVID times. And in contrast, church leaders were quite critical of parents in terms of their engagement with faith at home. Church leaders didn't necessarily know what was happening, but thought that parents weren't necessarily doing a great job. And parents really wanted relationship, they wanted listening, they wanted understanding from church leaders. And church leaders thought that parents needed more resources. So in terms of what families needed, church leaders were talking about, more resources in terms of time, in terms of people, in terms of physical resources for parents. And it was the opposite, actually, of what parents really needed. And there was such a big gap there. I think that's really noticeable in... and I think this ties into before, basically there's a perception that parents aren't doing a good job with this and that they need to do better. I think there's some research that backs that up, and I understand why that's a perspective. If we're looking at church numbers and church growth and all of the conversations that are kind of been at the forefront of some aspects of church life, particularly thinking about children and people in recent years. So I understand why, but I think there's a gap here. And a need for listening and understanding that goes deeper than some of those perceptions that I think we're holding on both sides of those kind of conversations.
And what do you think that gap tells us about the challenges facing church leaders and parents trying to work together? And just to throw a third thing into the mix, the Church of England at the moment is trying to create pipelines to train both volunteer and paid children's and youth leaders. So that's a kind of third element in there. So tell us a bit about how we might overcome that.
Yeah, I think there's this real challenge in terms of listening and communication. And, as a parent with young children myself in church, I know why that exists. It's actually really hard to have good conversations when you're watching where your children are at on a Sunday morning, when evenings and kind of additional time around working, around other family commitments can be really hard. So I don't necessarily think that what I want to suggest is simple or easy, but that element of listening and conversation, what is it that families in our congregations really need? And it won't necessarily be the same thing. So deep listening involves deep relationship. And so knowing our families and children, getting the opportunity to spend some time with them, that might mean doing something slightly different than the ways in which church leaders have done things before. Another challenge, I think, for parents particularly, and this has come out of some of the research that I'm currently writing up for my PhD research, is about confidence and criticism. So parents are really struggling with their levels of confidence, particularly around talking about faith with their children and talking about the Bible and kind of exploring questions. And they're often quite criticised. And that was evidenced in that report, but also elsewhere, that parenting styles and techniques are very different from what they were 50 years ago, probably even 20 or 30 years ago. And so parents are absorbing quite a lot of pressure and criticism. And so I think reshaping that narrative and starting from a point of encouragement is probably a really helpful place to start. And in terms of the Church of England's kind of, drive to make more pipelines and think about children's and youth ministry in particular, I think it's really fantastic that the Church of England has placed ministry with children and young people as the priority of priorities over the next few years in terms of the vision and strategy. And that, of course, involves, as you said, training and recruiting lots of new children's and family youth ministers. And I would love to see those ministers be really well trained, be prepared to listen, be prepared to take different approaches and do things slightly differently. I actually know lots of people who do that already and are doing an amazing job. But they're also seeking to serve a church that isn't necessarily well placed to receive them. And which perhaps, as I said, the challenge I think is to listen more deeply to the needs and the realities of family life today. And I think there's also, finally, a need for some deeper theological work about the why questions behind the focus on children and young people. And actually, the rest of the book that Emma and I have written is asking some of those why questions that I think are really important to start addressing those other questions too. I think probably for too long we haven't had the depth of theology that we've needed that will then seek to inform our practice and our engagement in different ways.
Can I take you back to the question of the drive to recruit children's and youth workers? It's great to see the Church of England aiming big and putting some money behind this and developing pathways. What do you think are some of the challenges that we might see in recruiting and training and deploying youth workers and children's workers?
Yes, I think that some of these are really big. I think there's a number of places in which these are being spoken about at the moment, but I think there's big questions about vocation. And how we're growing vocations amongst children's and youth ministers. I also think there's enormous questions about working conditions, about pay, about progression, and about lots of other opportunities for children's and youth ministers to be recognised as the kind of specialists and expert practitioners that they are. I think those are really significant challenges. It is great to see that funding, but there's a sense in which, we've encountered this at Cranmer as we're engaging in training and different initiatives to support this within the Church of England. There's a number of steps behind that need to be taken in terms of, yes, engaging with what does faith and vocation look like for people who want to seek this? What does formation look like? And I know that the Project 30K team have been doing lots of really great work about kind of qualities that we want to see in terms of character and formation for people who are serving in these roles. But I think there's a whole bigger picture there of putting those kind of building blocks in place to enable those pipelines of people to come through, to enable then the children and young people to be served in the ways that we're hoping to see.
So there is a whole bigger picture that you're alluding to here, which has a whole range of stages. It's been very encouraging to see the Church of England do some of that work in relation to clergy pay conditions, welfare. But part of what we're saying is we need that for every category of minister, lay or ordained, don't we? Let's move back then to the household. And you give a compelling account of some of the challenges that come with the desire to be open-minded and to let children come to their own decisions about faith. On the face of it, that seems like a really sort of reasonable thing to do, and it's the way that we would engage with adults who aren't part of our household, for example, in wanting to witness to them, but also not to pressure them and to leave it open for them to come to their own decision. But could you explain why that's a bit of a more complicated idea than it might seem for a child within the context of a household?
Yeah, we live in a culture, I think you've just kind of summarized this really well, Nick, that open-mindedness is really celebrated. I want to say I think that's really important. I think engaging with difference and diversity is really, really important. So I think it comes from a really good place, and it's something that I would also want to encourage and celebrate. Curiosity and deepening our understanding of difference is really, really important. Um, but when it comes to, I think, questions of faith and household faith, open-mindedness can unintentionally, I think, lead us in the opposite direction. So open-mindedness means that we then maybe don't make intentional decisions about our faith ritual practices at home, or our engagement with the Bible, or a host of other different things. And that is actually then a decision to shut those things down. And I'm not talking here about families who don't have a Christian kind of faith or background or want to do that. Of course, people will take all sorts of different decisions that they want to in terms of their family life. But for parents, I often hear from parents that Christian parents, they want to be open-minded and enable their children to make their own decisions. It's really hard to make your own decisions when you haven't got the full understanding of what it is that you're kind of doing, if that makes sense. So it kind of can shut down unintentionally the opportunities of faith and kind of growth and conversation, than open them up.
Mm. And returning to that Old Testament idea you brought up earlier, the concept that a child could choose a different way from their parents was not particularly a live option. Now we're in a very different culture, a very different age now, and in many ways the ability to choose is a more positive thing. And yet at the same time, there's this idea of the faith going on down the generations, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, of course, in the Bible, it wasn't really an option because there's a cultural element to that kind of faith and religion that is different, I think, to many of the kind of cultural elements to certainly kind of Protestant Christian faith today. I think what's interesting about that is even if a child had made a decision to kind of reject it, they would have done that from a place of kind of full awareness and full knowledge. And so there's that element that's tied into the background of it as well, being actually aware of what it is that you're either choosing for or not choosing.
Yeah. So there's a bit of nature abhors a vacuum. It's not like there is a neutral option here, is there?
Exactly. Yeah. Neutrality, I think, is the intention of open-mindedness, and actually neutrality is often a decision not to, even though the intention remains the same, to be open.
Yeah. And you're very clear here in advocating for intentionality, that you're not asking people or encouraging people to indoctrinate their children. Could you spell out the difference between what Ephesians would describe as raising your children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord and what we might see as indoctrination?
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely not what I'm trying to do.
Just to be clear.
Just to be absolutely clear, this approach has got to come with curiosity, with questioning, with the space for critical engagement and critical thought. And indoctrination, in contrast to that, I think is about the process of teaching someone to accept a set of beliefs with no criticality, completely uncritically, often through kind of repeated instruction and the suppression of questions. So indoctrination doesn't leave that space for questioning or curiosity. And I don't think that's what faith is about. And I don't think that's what the Bible teaches us that faith is about. Faith is about exploration and questioning. And actually, there's so many examples in the Bible when that has kind of, regardless of someone's background and understanding of the biblical story, they're still led to question and to be curious about that. And if we take that approach from Ephesians 6, we want to raise children and people who know the incredible story of the Bible, who know who Jesus is, who are able to bring their own questions and to wrestle with what that might mean for their own lives. And I think that again ties back to that sense of the Bet Av, the household of God in the Old Testament. If we don't share and explore those stories, which would have been such a fundamental part of ancient Israelite life, we can't necessarily expect our children to then grow in their faith and knowledge of God. Now, there's lots of research that also shows us that children under 2 have their own understanding and kind of encounter and relationship with God, regardless of the framework that exists around that. So I don't want to diminish the work of the Holy Spirit either. But in terms of being intentional about how we grow faith at home, it is about fostering curiosity and knowledge and storytelling, and a lot less about a set of uncritical beliefs.
My children are just a bit older than yours, and one of the fantastic things about children is the questions that they ask, isn't it? And so actually we want to encourage and nurture that rather than shutting it down. And one of my observations I've done more youth work than children's work, is that sometimes, particularly the older end of youth, if they've been in a Christian environment, they've kind of learned the right sorts of questions to ask, which sometimes can be a impoverishment, because actually when they bring honest, raw questions, that's a really fantastic thing. The other thing I'm thinking of, again, an Old Testament, there's so much resource there, isn't there, is the Passover meal and the tradition within Judaism that actually it's the youngest person at the Passover meal who asks the questions, why do we do this? And that's a lovely kind of way of bringing into a liturgy the fact that the young should be asking questions and that they should be given a real place and honoured.
And there's an intention in the Eucharistic liturgy in the Church of England. I'm going to get the letter wrong, having just confidently said that, but that mirrors that kind of the Haggadah, like the way in which the child would participate in asking those questions and having those responses. But you're absolutely right; it's about both those things, because the way that we often teach the Bible, particularly in church, is that there's right answers and there's set answers for things. We particularly do that in our kind of RE curriculum at schools as well. And so the space to ask the bigger questions that are actually unexpected or that, are not within the framework is also really, really important for children to be, and adults, honestly. I think so much of this stuff translates to adults as well. Let's ask the question that's the hard question. And that's really important.
Great. We won't ask you to identify the different Eucharistic prayers by their letters.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's G,
on the spot.
But yeah.
You talk about the theologian Sarah Brush. She uses the idea of staking a sapling, so planting a young tree, staking out a sapling, as a picture for how children should be supported as their faith grows. How do you think that picture is helpful, and are there any limitations to it?
Yeah, so really important caveat to this. So mine and Emma's book came out last week, in the same week that Sarah Brush's book came out, which is called The Way Through the Trees, and she explores in much more depth. So in the chapter that I wrote, she hadn't really kind of publicly written very much on her understanding of this kind of image of trees. She now has, but both of the books were published in the same week. So I'm really excited to read what she has to say, and I'm sure she says lots more additional things than the kind of snippets that we've had from her previously. So I think that's fantastic. But I really love her tree imagery. I think it's really helpful. I think it gives us lots more than so Fowler and Westerhoff, who've both written extensively about faith development, and have kind of produced quite different models to the one that Sarah has done. And what I love about it, it's really important to think about kind of childhood faith in all its potential. So the sapling that's growing and has that opportunity of growing into a beautiful tree, but also fragility at the same time. And so that image of staking that she's kind of produced, I think, is helpful, but I also think comes with some drawbacks. The reality is, any image that we use, I think, is probably not going to be able to perfectly capture what we wanted to communicate. But I think the stake image can be quite restrictive. So there's a stake that needs to be planted into the ground, and the stake is kind of designed to protect the sapling from going too far in the wind, being either direction. It can then mean that the sapling snaps because it's too restricted, it needs to bend with the wind. And I also think the reality is that adults also need support with their growth in faith. So if we're staking saplings, we probably want to think about how we scaffold and support faith in adults as well. I think one of the other drawbacks with the image is that it doesn't leave a lot of space for the Holy Spirit, or the recognition that actually faith growth and development isn't a linear process. And I think probably the biggest setback in that is that faith grows within the context of community and not just as an individual tree. That's not to say that our individual faith isn't important, but I think it, from my perspective, faith grows within community. So whether that's the community of a family or actually the community of a church, and a universal church, and the way that relationship is significant in that. So the image that I developed in the book, which I think still needs a lot of refinement, is recognizes that significance of community. So in terms of a forest imagery, the ways that faith is so impacted by so many things. So the storm that comes that actually does uproot the oak tree that stood for 50 years, and the ways in which actually a little sapling can grow in the cleft of a rock, which seems to not make sense. You know, it's got a very long taproot that goes all the way down to the ground. And so just recognizing there's a bit more of an organic imagery in how faith grows. You know, that there are seasons to the life of faith that we have. It's not just a kind of straight trajectory of progression through stages, for example. And so I think it's really helpful to use that tree imagery. And I also think it's not that we don't need additional resources and things around, you know. So I would want to, I'm sure that the stake involves Bible reading and faith practices and prayer and all those other things. That's really, really important. But I just want to complexify it and change it a little bit.
We need an ecosystem rather than just individual trees.
Exactly. And the thing that's really helpful that it helps me anyway, that idea of the fungal communication that happens amongst trees and the ways in which trees communicate with one another, and kind of, the ecosystem of faith. You know, I don't want to take the image too far. I think you can find it. In the Bible in lots of different places. I don't want to take it too far, but that sense of community and listening, and, you know, draws back to lots of the themes that we've already talked about today. I think that's really significant in thinking about how to support children, particularly and young people when they're growing in faith.
Excellent. Final question from me, Sarah. Could you tell us a bit about how your research has shaped your own parenting and your own faith?
Yeah, really deeply, and in ways that I find not necessarily easy. It's really shaped my approach to parenting at home. I think it's helped me to think really deeply about who my children are in Christ. And one of the things that I think is most empowering and releasing for Christian parents is that their relationship with God is completely unmediated by me. You know, that they have that existing. It's not something that I am responsible for or in charge of. I can absolutely encourage it, but that I'm really clear that the Bible tells me that they're known and loved by God really deeply. And I find that really releasing. And I find that impacts then the decisions we make and how to parent them, but particularly how we think about growing faith. I would recommend, Emma wrote a beautiful chapter, and she talks about the theological imagery, particularly the kind of lion and the lamb, and the ways in which in Isaiah we see God's heart for children. I think if you delve deeply, there's lots of these things are kind of simple and obvious things, but I think as you delve deeply into them, it really does change the way that you think about the children that you know, even if you're not a parent, the children that you know in your lives, the children that you know in church, and how valued and how deeply loved they are by God. So that really impacts me as a parent. One of my biggest passions, I think I said to you before, is about researching Bible reading with young children, and that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years, and that has enormously impacted the decisions that we make and the approaches that we take to parenting our children at home. I've tried lots of things that I think I probably wouldn't have tried. So, you know, reading the NRSV with them and reading different translations with them and exploring different things and having different conversations. And that's really impacted how I've approached storytelling more broadly as well, and using storytelling and integrating all the other different stories that we read and thinking about faith and talking about faith with my children. I think it's particularly helped me as I've navigated what it means to raise my children in a clergy household. So my husband is also ordained. And that presents a whole range of joys and challenges in and of itself. And I think my research has particularly helped me to think through some of those challenges that are kind of unique to that context. And that whole process of research and parenting has also just really impacted my journey of faith as a whole. I've been challenged so deeply by my children showing me more about who Jesus is. And they've encouraged me in my faith. They've taught me about prayer. They've taught me what it means to encounter God, to be curious, to make mistakes. They've really shaped my faith in terms of the questions that they've asked me. And I'm really grateful for the ways that my own faith has grown as I've parented them. And I've kind of sought to nurture theirs. It really is a kind of intergenerational process, I think, for all of us. But they've had a massive impact on me, probably the most significant one of all those things.
Amazing. Sarah, thank you so much for coming and talking to us. It's been great to have you on.
Thank you so much too. I've loved it.
Thank you for listening to Talking Theology, a podcast of Cranmer Hall, Durham, where we explore the best of academic theology and think creatively about how theological insights can shape Christian life, ministry and mission in today's world. If you enjoyed this episode of Talking Theology, subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. Follow us on X or Instagram at Talking Theo and share on social media. Cranmer Hall is a vibrant and diverse Christian community, forming Christ-like leaders for today's church. We offer training courses and degrees from BA to doctorate, available full-time and part-time, and we are home to students from a wide range of churches. Bursaries and scholarships are available to help with the cost of study. For details, visit our website, cranmerhall.com.